Go to Colossians 3. Because of time, I'm going to give like 5 more minutes, but we really do have to get rolling. Colossians Chapter 3. So normally, well, let's just wait 1 second. Let's see. Colossians chapter 3, and I believe we're right at verse 1, if my memory serves me right. At least that's what Neil told me where he left off at the end of Colossians chapter 2. Normally when you read one of Paul's epistles, typically, at least the shorter ones, you think about Philippians and Colossians, and you think about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, they have this sort of natural divide about 35? We're going to 11:35? Oh, even better. Well, now I can really slow down. Some of y'all are glad about that. I'm not. Yeah, Neil got up to preach today, and I'm like, man, I need to slow down a little bit. But anyway, he was talking at a good pace, and I felt like mine was over before I knew it. Anyway, all right, Colossians chapter 1 and 2, Paul's epistles normally divide right down the middle. And what you have in the first 2 chapters is really this doctrinal treatise, right? Paul starts out by talking about what we've been describing as the Colossian Heresy. There were these false teachers that had come in to the church at Colossae, and they infiltrated them with all of these various ideas. And there's really in this era that was being taught a hodgepodge of different ideas. There's some mysticism, some offshoots of Judaism, and various things that are being addressed. And Paul is talking about how Jesus is all you need. In him is all the wisdom and knowledge. Colossians 2 and 3. He's the image of God. Colossians 2 and verse 9. And so essentially Paul is saying if you have Jesus, you have enough. In Paul's letters, though, there's this divide. There's the theological side where Paul says, hey, here are the things that you really need to believe. Here are the things you need to hold on to. And then he will normally work that out and say, well, since you believe these things, here's how you should live. This is what your life should look like. Now, sometimes there's some overlap, but quite often you have this divide. Ephesians does the same thing. First 3 chapters, heavy theological truths. Last 3 chapters, here's how it's lived out in our lives. And the same thing is true about Colossians. First 2 chapters, theological truths. Last 2 chapters, this is how it's worked out in our life. Let me ask something to the class, and this is a personal thing, and just be honest. Give me some feedback on this. How would you describe yourself? I know the right answer, the perfect answer is both. I'm perfectly balanced, but be honest. Which one do you find yourself leaning more toward theologically? Are you more of what you would consider, I'm a study person, I'm more of the intellectual mindset, or I'm not really into so much as reading the Bible and studying as much as I like to get out and do stuff. I like to get out and be of service to God. We need both. I understand that. More on that momentarily. But I just want to take a brief survey of the class. Where would you say you find yourself? Where do you shine, Andy?
I'm probably weighted a bit more on the studying side.
Show of hands, study side. Show of hands, doing side. Okay. This is what we might think. Now, is that okay to be one side or the other? Yes or no? Yes. Y'all say yes. Yes. Yeah, we're wired different ways. But here's what we got to remember. God wants both of those things to blend. So, for example, you might think about passages in the Bible that say, be doers of the word and not what? Hearers only, James 1:22. But then you've got other passages that say things like, study to show yourself approved. You got to have both. In this section, so we've dealt with the sort of theological side. Here are the facts. Here's what we believe. Here's why. But now Paul's going to get into, beginning with Colossians 3 and verse 1, since you've been raised with Christ, or if you have been raised with Christ, Paul's going to get into the doing. But here's the deception for us. I believe that we sometimes think that the bridge from knowing to doing is like this. We think, well, if I just know, it's just a short gap to just do. But just think about your life and how many things you know you should do, and how often we fail to do them, because the reality is the bridge is more like this. It's not because God makes it difficult, but our will to put into practice what we know is often more difficult than we give it credit for. We know a lot of Bible. We know a lot of things. Many of us know enough to save several galaxies. We know a lot. But the bridge from knowing to obedience is not as close as we might sometimes think it is, and that's why the Bible doubles down on this point. Paul will say things repeatedly. You're thinking, why is he always reminding them, hey, since you've been baptized, get on with it, live the right life? Because just because you know things intellectually does not necessarily mean it always plays out practically. And so the Bible is trying to get us to see we got to close the bridge, guys. If you say, I'm heavy on the knowledge side, Paul's saying, that's great, study, know the Bible. And I would say I'm more on that side, but Paul's saying, Hiram, you got to be a doer. And if you're a doer, you say, hey, just give me a task, just give me a job and I'll do it. That's great. But Paul's saying, hey, you need some instructions so that you know into what direction you're running full speed. You've got to marry the two together. And that's what Paul tries to do for us. So let's open our Bibles. Let's look at Colossians Chapter 3. And I'm going to read the first 4 verses to us. And I'll talk about this after we read it. Let's read the first 4 verses. Who wants to read it for us nice and loud? I've got to preach again this afternoon. I'm trying to save my voice. I know some of you would like for it to go out, so we can sort of skip out early. Be like, go, voice, go. Okay, Nat's got us. Go ahead. Colossians 3, 1 through 4.
If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory.
Okay, so Paul starts out with, if you have been raised. Some translations say, since you've been raised. There's this kind of assumption. You might draw an arrow in your Bible from Colossians 3 and verse 1 back to chapter 2 and verse 12. You see that in chapter 2 and verse 12 where Paul says, you've been buried with him in baptism, in which also you were raised with him through faith, through the powerful working or the operation of God. So in Colossians chapter 2, Paul's saying, hey, God worked on you and gave you everything you need. Don't let these false teachers come in and tell you need more. Now, and then he takes this long aside in chapter 2 to talk about the false ideas. But in chapter 3, verse 1, he gets right back to what he was originally talking about. Since you've been raised. What's another way to say that? Since you've been raised. We might say since you've been what? Baptized. Since you've been baptized. So what happens to a person after they get baptized? What does God want from them? I would argue that the key theme here, we're going to talk about, and that's really what I would title this section, after baptism, or since I've been baptized, blank, blank, blank. And Paul's going to give us several imperatives. Imperatives are just commands, strong language that Paul uses to say, these aren't suggestions. Paul's not saying, look, guys, you'll be better Christians since you've been baptized if you do X, Y, and Z. That might be true. But Paul uses strong language to say, hey, since you've been baptized, here's what you must do. Here's what God is commanding for you to do. Here's how I want you to live out your lives. Now look at Colossians chapter 3. I believe verse 2 is the central theme. Set your mind on things above and not on things that are on the earth. And everything that Paul's going to say in this section centers around how to do that, how to set your mind on things above. It's not just intellectual. Well, just think about heavenly things all day. There are some practical things. So look at verse 1. Here's the first one. Since you've been baptized, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. So we've been raised with Christ, and we should put our mind toward things that are where? Above. This word above, I know it really just means heaven itself. That's how it's used in the Greek Old Testament, and that's how it's used in several places in the New Testament. Think Acts chapter 2 and verse 19, where it says that God would do wonders in the heavens above and in the earth below. It's the same idea. Paul is saying, seek things that are above. Put your mind on heavenly things since you've been raised with Christ. He's saying, as you came up out of the waters of baptism, you remember somebody pulled you out of the water, however long ago that was? As you were raised out of that water, Paul says, just keep with that upward trajectory. Keep thinking heavenward. Keep thinking about things that will matter in eternity. Set your mind, seek the things which are above. Why? Why should we seek things that are above?
That's where
Because
Christ
we've been
is.
raised with
Miss Rhonda, what'd you say?
That's where Christ
That's
is.
where Christ is. Remember, the whole theme in the book of Colossians is the supremacy of Christ and how we come to maturity through Jesus. Paul is saying, seek things that are above because that's where Jesus is and you're connected with him. If Jesus is in heaven, seated at God's right hand, you'll be close to God if you do what? Seek things that are above. The false teachers are coming in and saying, listen guys, if you really want to be close to God, you've got to get in our little group and you've got to do things our little way. Paul's saying, if you do that, you'll be stuck below on earthly things. Jesus is as close to God. I mentioned in the sermon, we talk about somebody being our right-hand man. What does that mean? They're your close confidant. You can trust them. When the Bible uses this terminology of Jesus at the right hand of God, God's a spirit. God doesn't have flesh and bone like we have. It's not like God really has a right hand. But God, Jesus is reigning, and he is as close to God in reigning and in rule as you could possibly be. And Paul is saying, guess what, guys? If you seek heavenly things where Jesus is, and Jesus is near God, I mean right there, guess what that means about you and me? We'll be right there too. You can't get any closer to God. If you really want to be close to God, shed the false ideas of these false teachers and just seek things which are above. Seek Jesus Christ. That's where Christ is. That's where you want to be. Seek things which are above. Notice this language of Jesus at the right hand. Go to Hebrews chapter 1. Hebrews chapter 1. And notice verses 1 through 3. Now again, Paul's point in Colossians chapter 3 is, set your affections on things above. Be centered on Jesus. And in Hebrews chapter 1, he starts out in verse 1 by saying, long ago, at many times, and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he did what? What did Jesus do? He sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. That is, Jesus is exalted. He's at God's right hand. He's near God. And in Hebrews, it's the same point being made. If you really want to be close to God, if you really want what God has for you, don't go back to Old Testament Judaism. You can't get any closer than Jesus Christ. He's God's final message to the world, and he's at God's right hand. That's where he dwells. It's the same sermon Peter preached in Acts chapter 2. You remember, he says, Jesus, God exalted. He's at his right hand, Acts 2, 33 to 36. And he's seated at God's right hand. Seek things which are above, because that's where Jesus is. That's how you're going to get close to Jesus Christ. Now, what does that look like? Set your what? Colossians 3 and verse 2. Set your what? Your mind on things above and not on things that are on the earth. How hard is it or easy it for you to control the things you think about? You know, you and I get to choose what we think about, whether we believe it or not. We say, well, things just kind of enter into my mind and I'm taken captive. It's really not that way. You and I get to decide what we think about. And Paul challenges us here to set our mind on things that are above. Why do you think Paul starts with the mind, though? Why wouldn't Paul say, if you've been raised with Christ, seek things which are above, where Christ sits at the right hand of God, and then, boom, 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 start saying we should do things like go out and do this, or make sure that you're doing this. Why does Paul start with the mind first? Set your mind on things above and not on things on the earth. Why does Paul start with the mind?
Your thoughts become your actions.
Your thoughts become your actions, yes. What else? Why would Paul start with the mind? God looks on the inner person. God looks on our hearts. 1 Samuel 16:7, it says when he selected David as king, God doesn't see as man sees. Man looks on the heart, yes. But why does God say, set your heart? Just think about it. All these answers have been good so far. Our thoughts become our actions. God looks on the heart. Any other reasons why God would say, if you want to seek heavenly things, get your mind on things above? Why start with the heart?
You're more likely to carry things out when it means that much to you.
If it means that much to us, we'll carry it out if we think about it and if we get our minds wrapped around it. Yeah, that's right. What else? Set your mind. Get your mind focused on it.
I think when you focus on things above, you forget fleshly desires and let yourself be toward God.
That's exactly right. And more on the fleshly desires in a moment. But yes, when you seek things above, you focus less on fleshly desires. Now, we're going to see who's a real honest person right now. Are you honest people? Show of hands. You say, I'm an honest person. We're going to put it to somebody said, this is a trap. Trap doors always coming. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a worship service, singing praises to God, partaking of the supper, maybe sitting in a Bible class, and thinking about other things? Show of hands, who's done that? So we just all feel indicted together. Great, great. Right? You've been in classes, you've been in sermons. I mean, locked in. I'm not talking about physically. People can look at you and say this person's checked out. I mean, you're with it. You're in the moment, and your mind's other places. That ever happened to you before? That says to me and to you that we can do the right things and our mind not really be there. Paul says, set your mind, because if the mind is right, the body will follow. But just because the body is following is not necessarily an indicator that the mind is. And so somebody could be doing the types of things that one might assume a heavenly seeker would do, but that's not in and of itself proof positive that they are. Paul says, get the mind, the body will follow. If you subdue the mind, if the mind is subject to Jesus Christ, your body is going to follow. It just has to. But it's not necessarily the other way around. And so he focuses on the mind first. Think heavenly, you'll act heavenly. You will. There's no other way around this. Paul says, set your mind on things that are above. Look at Philippians chapter 4. You know this verse, Philippians chapter 4, and notice verse 8. Now Paul says, don't worry about things, pray about everything. That's verse 6 and verse 7. But then in verse 8 he says, finally, brothers, whatever things are true, whatever things are honest, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there's anything virtuous or anything praiseworthy, then do what? Meditate or think about these things. And then look at verse 9. Those things you have both heard and received and learned of me, do them, and the God of peace will be with you. He says, think about it, and then you'll do it. And the same thing's true in Colossians chapter 3. Think about heavenly things, and then you'll do it. Change the way you think. Seek things that are above, where Christ is at the right hand of God. Focus your mind on things above and not on things on the earth. The world is always trying to get us to think about things here as if they're permanent. About things here as if these are the only things that matter. You know, your phone does this thing where it can show you how long you've been on it now, right? It'll show you how much time you spent on it and how much time you spent in actual apps. It'll show you how much time you spend on Facebook or how much time you spend on the internet, how much time you spend on your Bible app. You can just pull it up on your phone. It'll show you the different time slots and how much time you allocate toward each of those. Our minds have different compartments. And what if your mind could pull up, now here's the kinds of things you think about, and here's how often you think about those things. How much time in your mind and in mine would be allocated toward, I'm thinking about heavenly things. I'm setting my mind on heavenly things. You know, we think about our bills, we think about our health, we think about our jobs, our careers, we think about things going on globally, we think about health, things going on locally. Nothing wrong with thinking about those things, but you know what part of that pie should have the largest slice? Heavenly things. And it's only going to happen, somebody says, well, maybe if I attend more church services, that'll help you. Maybe if I study the Bible more, no doubt that's going to help you. But first, the mind has to become subject to God's will and doing things God's way. And so Paul says, give your mind over to it first. If God gets your mind, he gets the man. That's just the way it works. Surrender the mind to God and the rest will follow. Look at verse 3. Why should we do it? Because that's where Christ is. Paul says again, here's the second reason why we should seek things which are above. In verse 3, you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When did we die? When does that happen? At baptism. Yeah, that's right. You have died and your life is hid with Christ in God. So we should seek things which are above because we've already died to this world, right? Romans chapter 6 describes it as a crucifixion of sorts. As we go down in the water, we're saying to God, yes, I'm going to be faithful to you. It's an answer of a good conscience toward God, but we're also dead to the world. Galatians 6:14, Paul says, I'm crucified to the world, and the world is crucified to me. Seek things which are above because you've already died to this world. You've died to the world in what sense? Because there's a sense in which we're still here, isn't there? We still normally work at the same places, shop at the same stores, go to the same schools. So in what sense are we dead to the world and we shouldn't want anything to do with it? And in what sense are we not? In the sense that we're still very much a part of this world. What does Paul mean for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God? What have we died to, or in what way have we died? Sin?
The ways I know.
We've died to sin, the ways of the world. That's right. And what does that mean? We've died to sin in the ways of the world. What's changed about us then?
The things that the world says are the most important are not the things that we think are the most important anymore.
The things that the world says are most important? Yeah, we've changed. We've got a different value system now. What else? Help Andy out. What's another way to say what Andy just said? What's changed about us? He said what the world says is important is no longer important. We've got a different set of values. We've died to the world. What's changed about us?
Our mind.
Our mind, the way we think. It goes back to Colossians 3:2. What's changed about us mostly is our mind, the way we think. There'll be other changes, right? And Paul's going to talk about that in 5 through 9, about behavior and putting things to death. But what's really changed about us and has led to the outgrowth of what people can see manifested is our minds. How does somebody become a Christian? You have to hear the gospel. Then what's next? You have to believe it. And what's the next thing? We're going to sing the song. Hear, believe, repent. What's repentance? A change of mind that leads to a change of behavior. That's what repentance is. Paul said, you've already died to the world. Seek things which are above because you've died to the world. You've already changed the way you think. So the world has nothing to offer you as far as its philosophies and the way that you go about living. You're a new person. You've got a brand new mind. And the way that you prove that is you set your mind on things above. Look at Matthew chapter 6 and notice what Jesus said about heavenly treasures and earthly treasures and where we should have our focus. Now this is the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus says here, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And we normally stop there in verse 21. Jesus says, lay up treasures in heaven, not on earth. You know, the earthly stuff, moths will get to it, it'll rust, it'll be corrupted. But stick with Jesus. Look at verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And then in verse 24, he'll talk about serving more than one master. But that section in 22 and 23 where Jesus says the light of the body is the eye, he's saying if you have the right view toward material possessions, your whole body will be full of light. But he said if the light that's in you is darkness, your whole body is going to be filled with darkness. You've got to be able to become a quick and ready appraiser of where things ultimately have value. And if you realize that the heavenly things have more value, you'll seek those things and not the things that are on the earth. You've already died to that way of thinking, that you get your value from stuff and mess and junk. You've changed over. You've got the lamp of the body that is the eye that is full of light. And so you can see things which are above. Since you've been baptized, since you've been raised with Christ, now you think like God. All the stuff we said before, God looks at the heart and all of that, that's how we're trying to train our minds and hearts to think. And now that's how Christ wants us to live. And so Paul says, hey, you've died to the world. Now, that's easy to read on this page, but how many of us still struggle to live the crucified life as if we've actually died to the world? What makes it difficult for you? I'm not talking about somebody out there in the world. I'm saying what makes it difficult for you to think about Colossians chapter 3 and verse 3, for you've died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. What makes it challenging for you to think about the fact that the thing that really matters the most is my relationship to Jesus Christ. And I've been raised with him, and my life is hidden with him. That word hidden is as if it's kept. Crypto, it means God's taking care of it. It's concealed. It's protected. Nothing can happen out here to destroy my life with God. Up there, I'm set with God no matter what happens. We know that intellectually. But remember I told you, the bridge between knowing and doing is not as close as we think. It's further than we ever really imagined. We need a divine bridge to make the connection. What makes it hard for you? I mean, tomorrow, well, not even really tomorrow, whenever our service ends today, when we say the last amen, the devil already started working on us to say, now that was spiritual stuff, that was the spiritual fodder for the week, and he'll already get on top of us about what matters more, what deserves more of our attention, what's really more pressing. You know those heavenly truths you believe, okay, so what, believe them, but they're millions of years away. You've got right now problems, kids got school, these pressing needs and jobs and concerns and fears. And what makes it hard for you to remember that you have already died? That's Paul's way of saying you're already a winner. You've already won. What makes it hard for you to remember that and to put it into practice?
James 1:14 says that we're tempted and lured away and enticed by our own desires. So it's really different for different ones of us, but it's really whatever it is that we're searching after and wanting to do, that's what pulls us away from those spiritual things.
We're drawn away of our own lust and enticed, our own desires. And as David mentioned, those desires are different for every one of us. Those things we feel like we just have to have. And listen, God's not against ambition. God's not against your desiring things that hopefully will help you to be more faithful to Him and better. But when those things override spiritual things, I think that's when we get in trouble. Bryce, did you have something?
No.
Oh, don't wave in your hair or anything. I'll call on you. I promise. All right. Yeah, so it's challenging because we have different challenges, different lusts and enticements. What else makes it hard for us to focus on that which truly matters, or more importantly for you? Andy?
It's a lot more natural to be focusing on the things that you can see than the things that you can't. Out of sight, out of mind is a phrase that we use, and it's also kind of one of those things that you do with babies, right? Because when a baby can't see something, they think it stopped existing, and then when you uncover their eyes, they see it again. Oh, there it is. You can see their delight when this thing has become existing again. And in many ways, spiritually, we can be the same way. Where when we're not looking at it, it's almost like it's not even there. That can be a big challenge.
Most of us know this verse. I start this verse. You all can finish this. We walk by faith and not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7. We quote that verse, but that's what Paul's calling for us to do here. Paul's saying, not out of sight and out of mind, out of sight on my mind, right? Paul's saying, I want you to be thinking about it. Just because our heavenly treasures are invisible doesn't mean they're imaginary. Paul's saying they're just as real as you and me. And you can seek those things which are above because you've already trusted in them by being baptized where Christ is. Look at verse 4. When Christ, who is your life, this gets to what Andy's talking about, those things will be realized. You kind of open the eyes again. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with Him in glory. We tend to think about glory this way in the New Testament. And glory is this idea of God's brightness or His manifestation. It can be God's weightiness or God's awesomeness. We think about God's glory, and we should. But the New Testament says when Jesus comes again, there's not only going to be something that happens before us. There's going to be a shout. There's going to be the voice of the archangel and the trumpet of God. The New Testament says something's going to happen in us and with us. It won't just be, well, Jesus comes back in His glory. Paul's saying when Jesus comes back, it'll be our glory. Remember, where's Jesus? He's at the what hand of God? Right hand of God. If you and I stay close to Jesus, we're going to be that close too. And it is impossible to get that close to glory and not be glorified yourself. It just can't happen. The closer we get to God, He's saying, you're going to enjoy those pleasures and those treasures as well. Look at Romans 8. Go to Romans 8. And notice, who wants to read Romans 8? Who wants to read a verse for me? Dave? Okay, great. You can read. He had that reader look on his face, you know. Some people just have that. Okay. Romans chapter 8, and notice verse number 18. Romans 8:18.
For I consider that the sufferings
of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us.
Now, different translations do this different ways. Sometimes they say to us or something like that. But Paul's saying, hey, the suffering you're presently enduring, it's not worth comparing with the glory that's going to be revealed in us or to us as a part of that manifestation of God's glory. And then he goes on to talk about that down through 19 through 23, really. The resurrection of the body is something that's going to happen to us. Paul says, seek heavenly things because there's going to be a great reward. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, let's just turn over there. Look at this passage as well about our glorification with God. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. In verse 16, he says, even though we suffer, we don't lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. You see that? It's not just going to be Jesus' glory. It's preparing for us an eternal weight of glory as we look not to the things which are seen. That sounds familiar. The same Paul said this in Colossians 3, right? Not the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. The things seen are transient or temporary, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Seek things which are above, because everything you see, everything you can put your hands on, they say at the grocery store, if it has an expiration date on it, the longer that date is, the worse it is for you health-wise, right? So the oatmeal pies I love to eat and all that, they say they last you 6 and 7 months. It's not good for you, right? The longer that expiration date is, the worse it is for you. In this life, everything you can see, it has an expiration date on it. But Paul says in Colossians 3 and verse 4, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, the one we've been living for, all our hopes and dreams are wrapped up in him. We've changed the way we think. We haven't fallen for fool's gold anymore. We realize what really matters. We'll also appear with him in glory. Something won't just happen for us, but something's going to happen to us and with us. His glory will become ours. We'll enjoy it together with him. It's going to be great. And so Paul's saying, hey, seek heavenly things. Put your mind on the things that really matter. I was asking a moment ago, what makes it hard for us to focus on the fact that we've died and our lives are hidden with Christ in God? And I think one of the things that makes it difficult, David talked about the different kinds of lusts that we all struggle with on the inside. I believe that one of the biggest temptations that the devil throws at all of us, and he does this in different avenues of our life, I think he says to us, you really are missing out. And I think he said, Christianity's okay, it's pretty good, but you're really missing out on the glorious life you could be living. And I'm not even necessarily mentioning here inherently sinful things, as much as he's saying even things that would be otherwise good deserve more of our attention than throwing ourselves fully into the work of the Lord. I know people who've obeyed the gospel, and they're pretty moderate Christians, they're pretty decent, but it's almost like they're afraid to really Colossians 3:1, to really do it, to really seek things which are above. So they're kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out. I mean, they'll come every now and again, but they're not really going to come to any extra functions or do any. They really don't want to. And it's not that these people would say they don't love God, they don't love Christ, but there are just other things that are more pressing. They're going to give God a little bit of time, and they're not going to totally turn their back on the church or anything like that. But there are just some things going on that I just can't miss out on this. If I miss out, we sometimes say this, a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity, right? Paul's saying for Christians, there's no such thing. Because everything that's good, everything that's true, everything that's eternal that really matters, it's going to be ours when Jesus comes again. You're not missing out. This really is the best life to live, and you can throw yourself fully into it. You can seek things which are above and ultimately be a winner. Set your mind on things that are above. That's why you were baptized, and your life is hidden with Christ in God, and when he appears, he'll show you that it was worth it. Now, in this next section, go to Colossians Chapter 3 and notice from verse 5 down through verse 9. He says this is what you're supposed to do. So there are several imperatives. I told you that. He says in the first place to seek. That's Colossians 3 and verse 1. That's one imperative. You might circle these commands or underline them. Seek the things which are above. That's the first command, imperative. Verse 2, set your mind on things above or think about things above. That's the second imperative. And now here's the third one in Colossians 3 and verse 5. He uses a word for kill or mortify. The old King James has. Put to death what is earthly in you. And then he lists a bunch of things. And this is how we know what Paul's talking about when he says seek heavenly things over earthly things. He's not saying we have to live a monastic lifestyle away from everybody, never enjoy anything fun or do anything that normal people in the world might do. He's saying change what you think true joy is and stay away from sin. stay away from the things that will ultimately ruin your life. He says, put to death what is earthly in you. Here's my question. You all told me a moment ago, Colossians 3 and verse 3, when do we die? At what? At what point? Baptism? We good with that answer, everybody? If we die at baptism, and we do, why does Paul say to people who've already been baptized? He said that in Colossians 2:12, hey, you've been baptized. In Colossians 3:1, he says they've been raised. Why does Paul say now in Colossians 3:5, put to death what is earthly in you? I thought they did that at baptism. Yes, sir.
Well, because Paul understands the way the mind works and how we are drawn to the negative of the world. And he also understands that in order to create that positive growth that we desire, we do have to consciously deal with that mindset.
Yeah.
Right? It's not something that's just going to change because we were baptized.
That's right. Why? Anybody else on that? Why would Paul say to people who've already been baptized, put to death? Neil?
Well, the crucifixion we undergo is different from what even Jesus did on the occasion. Paul said, I died daily. It's an ongoing. I can crucify myself once, take up my cross and follow him, but I got to keep doing it. And a victory yesterday does not assure victory today if I change from the plan that Paul gives us here.
Yeah. J.J. Watt says success is not owned, is rented, and the rent is due every day, right? And so listen, here's the thing, and we need this, because I don't know, sometimes I feel like, man, if I really repented, God, and I promised God I'm going to do better, why am I in this same situation again, right? I feel like a bad Christian. You said, I'm not going to say that anymore, and now you find yourself saying it again or thinking it again. I'm not encouraging us to walk in the way of unrighteousness. I'm just saying if you struggle with sin, and I mean the same one, sometimes repeatedly for a long amount of time, it just means you're a normal human being. You're a Christian like everybody else. Doesn't mean you're not sincere or you didn't really mean it when you repented the first time. If you turn away from it, Paul says, yeah, you're done with sin. That's great. Sin's not through with you. You're going to have to keep fighting. Well, how often do I have to fight, Paul? Every day. He commands them, mortify your deeds which are on the earth. Well, I thought they did that at baptism. They did. But these things come back over and over again. And we've got to keep fighting to put them to death. So as you seek things above, it doesn't mean you're not seeking, because there's still sometimes worldly things that pull on your heart. It just means you've got to keep swinging and keep fighting back. And we'll let Neil pick up in Colossians 3:5 next week. Thanks for a good class. Appreciate your participation. Good to see you. Keep aggravating you, but I want to encourage you.
I know. I've got significant excuses. Thanks for a good lesson. Appreciate it.
You have like a limit of how many days every day?
That's what asking about. I'll tell you that.
I stress out over these cars, 20,000 or.
Thank you.